The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
In an unusual occurrence, we welcome back last week's guest, National Democratic strategist Chris Durlak. The reason Chris is coming back is the Democrats performed surprisingly well in the midterms this past Tuesday. Something that this host got wrong. As I had predicted, a significant pickup in the House for the Republicans. It appears clear now they have taken the House, but the margin is going to be probably in single digits, somewhere between 7 and 13. They're still counting some races, but they will, in fact, the Republicans will take the House, and the Senate could actually go Republican as well. It's going to come down to a runoff in Georgia between Walker and Warnock on December the 6th. But having said that, and as I had been predicting a red wave, I intend to be candid about my misforecasts, as this was, that in fact the red wave did not happen. And I thought it appropriate to bring back Chris because he had very eloquently argued for the reason the Democrats would perform above what people thought, and they clearly did. So for that reason, Chris is back to be on this show. And as I kiddingly said, I'm going to let him take his victory lap. It was well earned. And I'm going to remind those who may have not seen the show last week or even remember his credentials, he is a national strategist. He's a partner currently in Purple Strategies, a national firm based in Washington, D.C. Purple Strategies is one of the top political consulting firms in the country, as well as one of the top private sector corporate consulting firms. Chris was a graduate of George Mason University and began his career as a political media consultant at then McMahon & Squire, a national firm that consults the Democratic Party on presidential elections, governor's races, U.S. Senate races, as well as congressional and state assembly races. Eventually, McMahon & Squire merged with other consulting companies to form Purple Strategies. Chris has consulted on campaign ads for the National Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, otherwise known as the DCCC. Also, the National Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, or the DSCC. The Indiana State Democratic Party, the Virginia Senate Democratic Caucus, as well as numerous congressional and state races in Texas, Indiana, Iowa, and Virginia. In addition to his political work, Chris is a veteran corporate media strategist, advising business and communication leaders at companies in both the United States and globally across categories that include energy, consumer goods, healthcare, financial services, and defense. His most significant accomplishment was accepting a leading role in crafting public messaging for British Petroleum after their catastrophic oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Chris's guidance was pivotal in restoring trust and acceptance of responsibility on that energy giant. Chris also serves on the George Mason University Board of Trustees Foundation, and he does pro bono work with the Washington, D.C. Dream Center. We will let him break down what he saw happen this past Tuesday, and I will obviously speak for the other side of it as well.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial. The area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Chris, welcome back to the Volpe Report.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'd like to point out, I have been predicting on my show and in my views that there was a red wave coming this November 8th. And if a high tide you could call a tsunami or a tidal wave, I don't think you can. In fairness, that means I was incorrect in my prediction. And the reason you're back on so quick to remind my voters, you made and articulated, as you always do very eloquently, the Democratic messaging and what you thought might happen, and some of the difficulties in the Republican messaging. None of which I agreed with at the time, by the way. Even if I didn't articulate it, I was thinking, He's wrong about that. Well, obviously, you were right about a lot of what you said. And so I'll give you your victory lap today because you were so prescient in some of your predictions, especially things like, while acknowledging some of the Democrats' messaging infirmities and issues that were not good for Democrats, you also pointed out that the Republicans had not particularly articulated a plan of their own, except for Senator Tim Scott, which wasn't the plan I think they wanted to be broadcasting. But having said that, it was only a trickle, not a tidal wave. It does appear, although not statistically impossible for Democrats to take the House, in all likelihood and mathematically, it will be a Republican House. Right now, the Senate's too close to call. It could go either way. We'll probably come down to the December 6th runoff in Georgia between Warnock and Herschel Walker. But I like your take on the November 8th results and why the Democrats feel, even though they're going to probably lose the House, feel like they won a victory of sorts. Take it from there.
Yeah, it was a big night for President Joe Biden. I appreciate you having me back on to take the victory lap, by the way. So thank you. Not everyone would do that.
Well, let me just interject quick. I've been getting some criticism up here that I'm too conservative and I don't have enough Democratic, liberal points of view on my show. So I'm working towards eradicating that with the person I trust, who's intelligent and intellectual and does his homework and just doesn't repeat or diatribes from propagandists. You're the guy, so go ahead.
Absolutely. Well, look, I think there were there were red waves last night. There was a red wave in Florida for sure. There was a red wave in Texas a bit, and I think there were also blue waves last night. There was a blue wave in Pennsylvania.
Of course.
Not only did John Fetterman win, obviously we all know Josh Shapiro was going to win by a huge margin, but the Pennsylvania State House may flip to Democratic control. So that's obviously a big development. And in Michigan, Governor Whitmer, who had a huge night and I think is a future star of the Democratic Party, much like Ron DeSantis had a huge night in Florida, Governor Whitmer had a huge night in Michigan, not only winning the governor's race again by a healthy margin, but also taking back the Michigan House and Senate. And so that was a big night. So I think, this was a really interesting election because in different states, different things happened. Democrats did really well in some places, Republicans did well in others. And I think it's, partially because of one, I think because people looked at what President Biden had done and were liking what they saw more than what they saw what the Republican alternative was offering. And I think that really drove it at the end of the day. And Trump, obviously being a looming presence for Republicans, he came in at the last minute in Pennsylvania to do some big rallies and went to Georgia, went to other places. And, I don't think Republicans are going to necessarily want him to come back, but it's kind of a big inflection point for the party right now. We'll see which way the party chooses.
Yeah, I agree with just about everything you said. The only one thing I would quibble with slightly, and you did touch on it at the end there, is that I don't think it was an issue as much of Republican messaging per se, although they really didn't do as good a job articulating, answers to some of the issues they raised. Agree on that point, and you made that point last week very clearly. But I think it was more the looming presence of Trump. I think what the electorate did, and I believe an electorate that was predisposed to create a red wave, for moderate Democrats and independents to vote Republican in light of, as we talked about, record inflation, bad economy, a crisis at the border that's gone unabated, crime at record numbers. I thought those issues would create the red wave, but the answer I believe the voters gave, and this is instructive for America and for both parties, is we care about that greatly. And almost always, to quote James Carville, it's the economy, stupid, almost always vote that way. But this time, if there is the specter of Trump or an existential threat to our republic and our democracy, and if he has radically his endorsed back candidates running, we're voting Democrat and we're staying the course because we're not going to vote for extremists. We're not going to vote for chaos. And specifically, believe it or not, as we sit here in Pennsylvania, as fellow Pennsylvanians, even though you're in Washington in your firm, the fact of the matter is we saw that firsthand in Pennsylvania. So that was the only thing. I don't disagree that Republican messaging wasn't everything it should have been. I agree, in fact, but I don't think that was decisive. See, then I think the other issues would have trumped that and they would have voted Republican. I think it was the specter of the Doug Mastrianos of the world, of the Oz's of the world, of many candidates, top ballot and down ballot, all across this country. People voted, even Republicans said, no to extremism. And they were right to vote no to extremism, even if they had to gulp hard on some of the other issues that I think would have caused them to vote red. Your thought?
No, I agree with that. The only thing I would add is, if you think about 2010, which was President Obama's first midterm, where Republicans picked up over 60 seats, unemployment was at a record high then. Unemployment today, while inflation is high than it's ever been in a long time, unemployment is way down. And so I don't think the economy has been as clear cut as a Republican winning issue for those reasons. One is unemployment remains low, and two is Republicans have yet to articulate what they would do differently about the economy, other than occasionally talking about more tax cuts, which isn't the answer to everything. And so I think on the economy, Democrats have done well. I think there's issues that things like capping the price of insulin, right? That is something that's going to take effect next year. Legislation that was passed this year is going to take effect next year. That are just real pocketbook issues that the president's happy to talk about. That I think people respond to. A lot of people don't know these things have happened, but they're starting to know. And I don't think, and I think the best news for Joe Biden of that night is he now has some equity as president. I'm not saying he has a mandate or anything like that, of course not, but he has some equity. He doesn't have to worry so much about his left flank. And I think, as we were talking about, President Biden's already trying to extend the olive branch, as he always has, wants to work with Republicans. And I just think that's who he is. That's who he's always been. That's how he got a lot of things done in his first 2 years, and I think that's what we'll see in the next two. And of course, the big question is whether or not he'll run again.
Right. Well, right now, still a majority of his own party says no. That's according to the latest polls. That is pre-November 8th, of course. That could change based on what's happened. There are prognosticators, Chris, that I respect on both parties, strategists. And both were in agreement, again, pre-November 8th, that Joe Biden would not have been in the ratings pickle dilemma he was in had, in fact, the Georgia runoff in 2020 not gone the way it went. Had, in fact, the Republicans kept even a slim majority and Mitch McConnell stayed the leader in the Senate, you would have seen a different Joe Biden. He would have had the moral authority to keep his, quote, left flank in check and say, if we're going to get anything done, I have to work with a Republican Senate, and I'm going to go see my old colleague of 30 years, Mitch McConnell. I'd predicted on this show before the runoff, after the election of Joe Biden, where he won, I had predicted that he's going to go in the Senate cloakroom and bring out a 24-year-old bottle of Blue Label, Scotch, Johnny Walker, and they're both going to get cigars, and he's going to say to his old buddy Mitch, how can we get stuff done for this country? I think it actually broke bad in a way because it was such a split in the Senate and so close. He had such thin margins, but it still was a margin enough that he needed that far left part of his party to get anything done. So he was kind of between a rock and a hard place. I'm actually defending to a degree Joe Biden. I understand that. But I think he will be more effective now if he has to deal with the Republican House, possibly even a Republican Senate. Your thought?
Yeah, I would just say Republicans continue to underestimate Joe Biden, and I always wonder when they're going to stop. They said when he ran for president that he was dead in the water before South Carolina, that the race was over. He did it. They said, he wouldn't beat Trump, that he was, too old and senile or whatever they're saying now, and he wouldn't do that. But yet he continues to defy expectations. No president has had a better midterm in the last nearly 100 years than President Biden had last night, midterm election. Right. And that is just incredibly impressive. And I remember, I don't know if you remember the old Saturday Night Live skit with Ronald Reagan, where outwardly, when Reagan was meeting with constituents, he had the Girl Scouts in, and he was this kind, grandfatherly, nice person. And then the doors would shut and the maps would come down and he'd be barking out orders. That's Joe Biden. That's President Biden. I feel like, underestimate him at your peril. Yeah.
Well, on that note, Chris, we're going to take a short commercial break. When we come back now, we're going to talk going forward, where we go from here, and obviously politically where we go from here. We'll be right back after these messages. November 8th's surprising result requires that I acknowledge my mistaken prediction about the outcome. I had predicted a seismic shift in the U.S. House of between 40 and 60 seats. I wasn't close. The Republican majority will be between 5 and 10 seats. The red wave turned out to be a trickle. I have told you that on my Views and show, we intend to be candid about our mistakes and expect you to point them out when we miss them. So what did we miss? We missed the strange toxicity of former President Donald Trump's influence on the Republican Party. The number of Trump-backed Republican candidates across the nation's ballots that got blown out ended any hopes of a red wave. So the electorate was perfectly clear that while 75% of voters believed the country was heading in the wrong direction, usually doomed for the party in power, they would not vote for extremists or election deniers, because the country's interests were properly placed before their own. For once, James Carville was wrong. It wasn't the economy, stupid. Which brings us to the future roadmap for both parties. I will now quote from a usual source, the Washington Post, George Will, in his postmortem of the election. The election results should move both parties to introspection. Journalists, too. Republicans cannot win with former President Donald Trump defining them. Democrats cannot win by invoking Trump's specter to stifle debates about their Democratic policies. No cash bail, greed causes inflation. That stroke their base's erogenous zones. When, however, Trump is scrubbed from the public square, this cleansing will be welcomed by an exhausted electorate, but will be decomfitting to both parties. Republicans will be forced to articulate an agenda, and Democrats will be forced to defend their agenda. End quote. I think Mr. Will nailed it. There are paths to the promised land for both parties. The Democratic path will be to leash and muzzle their left progressive radical arm. You know, their progressive caucus, the Green New Dealers, the defund the police advocates, the critical race theory zealots, the border is secure fiction, and the shutdown of all domestic energy production dreamers. They also have to figure out what to do with their incumbent president, with half the Democrats polling that he should not be their nominee for president in 2024. Republicans have to purge themselves of Trump. This is a delicate balance, but there is a template for how. Specifically, how Glenn Youngkin won Virginia's gubernatorial contest. He praised the former president's policies, the America First agenda, and anti-wokeism, but made clear he was not an election denier and did not support the January 6th insurrection, while not appearing on stage with the former president. In other words, support the good Trump policies and get the nuclear-safe distance from his radical theories and quirks of personality. Secondly, Republicans must find a young, strong leader that has the strength, courage, and intelligence to pull that off. Based on Tuesday's outcome, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis comes to mind. As I said before we went to break, this is the part of the show we talk about the future. We're already in the 2024 cycle. I know for people that aren't in politics as much as you're professionally in it, and I'm kind of professionally in it, no, it already started. So the 2024 cycle is here and it's upon us now. And I believe, as you and I have talked, I believe there are issues and paths for both parties going forward. Paths to potential victory and paths to defeat and Armageddon. So I'm going to let you take the Democratic side first. I defer to your expertise.
Well, obviously, the big question on the Democratic side is whether President Biden decides to run for re-election. From talking to people around Washington, people aren't sure whether he's going to run or not. I think he's undecided, and I think if he does run, I think the nomination will be his. And I think the case that he would make is, had a very successful first few years, had a successful election that we saw this week. And that if we want to prevent Trump from getting back into the White House, let's stick with the guy who beat him in 2020, and that'll be a pretty strong case. If it's not him, I think we do have a bench that continues to grow in the Democratic Party. I think coming off of last night, watch Governor Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. I think she could be an incredibly strong candidate. I think Pete Buttigieg, who's the Secretary of HUD, could also be an interesting candidate. And we have the governor of Maryland, the governor-elect of Maryland, Wes Moore, who just got elected. I'm not sure when he's going to run for president, but it might not be this cycle, but it will be soon. He is, I think, one of the fastest rising stars in the Democratic Party. And so there'll be a lot of options there. And I think Republicans are, whether Trump wins the nomination or not, Trump is going to loom over the 2024 election. And Republicans are going to have to deal with him one way or another. And I don't have a lot of confidence that based on this cycle, based on 2020, based on how they reacted after losing in 2018, that they're gonna cut ties from Trump. I think some will, but I think many won't. And I think that small House majority that you talked about, that Republicans are likely to have, a big part of that caucus that a Speaker McCarthy will have to keep is those who are very connected to President Trump, like the Jim Jordans, like the Marjorie Green Taylors. They could, if it's a 3 to 5 seat margin, they could hold all the power in Kevin McCarthy's House.
I know this is controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway. And I kind of already alluded to it. I believe the red wave would have happened in this country had Donald Trump's presence not loomed over it. But he did more than loom over it, Chris. He literally put and handpicked candidates that all got destroyed across this country. I don't know if he was keeping score. He doesn't tend to like to admit losing, as we know. It was a huge loss. As much as it was a great night for Ron DeSantis, the Republican governor of Florida, it was a horrible night for Donald Trump. He lost from sea to shining sea, all across the country. And they like to say, well, what about J.D. Vance? He picked him. Well, J.D. Vance was already a national celebrity. He won an Academy Award for Hillbilly Elegy. Everybody already knew who he was. So I'm not saying Trump's support didn't help him. Obviously it did. But having said that, if that's your one victory, that's Pyrrhic and questionable anyway. So getting back to what I said earlier, Americans of both parties said, we do not want extremist candidates. We do not want election deniers. We don't want threats to our democracy. We don't want people that were at the January 6th riot at the Capitol, which Doug Mastriano, our nominee, happened to be. That was when he wasn't getting the sword from QAnon nut radical crackpots. So having said that, I think that that's going to be the issue for Republicans, that they have to, Donald Trump, it's okay to talk about his policies, his America First agenda, and some of the good things Republicans rightly believe he did. But having said that, he's not even focused on any of that anymore. The former president's still talking about the 2022 election fraud and that he didn't lose, and it's over. And Republicans have a duty to their country to move on. That it's over. So, having said that, I think their path forward is one of the big things you said before the election that was right. You said a bunch of things right. Was the Republicans have to articulate a policy. We all understand we have record inflation. The economy's in trouble. We could be in a recession, especially when the Feds are going to raise interest rates even again. And that usually does trigger a recession. We have a crime issue in this country. We have an issue at the border, a bad issue that has to be addressed. And the bottom line is the Republicans have to articulate their solutions, not just say the Democrats mucked it all up. I tend to agree the Democrats mucked some of that stuff up. But having said that, we're past the muck up part. You know, that old Chinese proverb, don't curse the darkness, light a candle. Republicans need to light candles now. They need to purge themselves, as George Will alluded to, from Donald Trump before they will be taken seriously by the American electorate. And that's a fair test for the American electorate to hold against Republicans. If you can't separate yourself from him, why would we trust you? Even if we like some of what your ideas are, you have to give them Glenn Youngkins of the world as candidates. You have to give them Ron DeSantis, who snubbed Trump's Florida rally. What was his reward? He won Florida by the largest margin in history. He turned Democratic 4-1 Dade County, Democratic blue stronghold, a 40-point swing in 4 years. He won it by almost 20 points. One Democratic strategist said, Chris, that the worst nightmare for Democrats would be if Ron DeSantis beats Donald Trump in the primary, because they do expect Trump to run. He said if DeSantis runs, and he thinks he would beat him, it would be a bloodletting. But having said that he would be the one guy Democrats fear most, that they would have trouble finding a candidate to beat Ron DeSantis. So having said all that, that's my path for Republicans. Articulate a message, nominate Ron DeSantis for president, which will, by in and of itself, kind of push Trump to the sideline. Anybody that hears Ron DeSantis speak won't in any way confuse him with anything Donald Trump stands for. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what you said. Well, let me start with what Donald Trump posted this morning about Ron DeSantis' victory in Florida, which is that when he ran in 2020, he got more votes than Ron DeSantis got last night. Oh, so that is
pretty typical Trump response.
Exactly. He's better. I think, I think it's an interesting question if Ron DeSantis wants to run this cycle. I think it's actually a tough, just taking off my partisan hat for a second, I think it's a tough choice for him. Does he want to get into the race with Donald Trump, who has a very, very devout following, and get a nickname? Trump tried Ron DeSanctimonious. He's probably workshopping that a bit, as he always does. Right. And we'll see what he comes up with. But does he want to get called names like others have and get in a knockdown, brutal fight that's going to divide a lot of the Republican Party? Or does he want to just wait another 4 years and see how this shakes out? He's a very young governor, and has time. He's 44, so he has lots of time. So there's no rush. And so the question is does he want to be the one who takes on Trump? And that's a tough decision for him. I do think, whether he wins or not, it's I know you appreciate history a lot. I mean, when was the last time we had a former president running again and running around trying to influence a party like this? Most presidents in the modern era, when they lose, step away. Jimmy Carter, President George H.W. Bush. We've never really had this. We've never had a former president do this. And we don't really know what the impact is going to be. So it's going to be a really fascinating, wild 2 years, I think.
No doubt. I just add on to that comment. Even when he was president, we had a lot of things no other president ever did.
That's true.
So he is continuing what he's already done. Chris, thank you for your time. Congratulations on your predictions. Chris Durlak is a name that I will keep promoting because, as you and I hopefully demonstrated, as I and Vince Galco, I hope, demonstrated, it's okay to agree to disagree on certain points in a collegial American way that doesn't involve name-calling or resentment or bitterness. Unfortunately, a few people in Congress could take that hint. But as always, my friend, thanks for your time, and I'll be talking to you soon.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks, Chris.